Close your eyes for a moment and picture a world where the fate of your child is auctioned off by bureaucrats, where the laughter echoing in your home is silenced by horse hooves descending at dawn, where the future of entire villages is mapped out in dusty ledgers, every name reduced to a number, every human life appraised and priced. Welcome to the shadow empire of systematic enslavement, and this is only the beginning. From the earliest days of expansion, the Islamic Caliphates wielded conquest not merely as a tool of territorial gain, but as a machine of human reduction. What you've heard of slavery, chains, plantations, the hellish Middle Passage, is but a sliver of the true story. Long before gunpowder would shake Europe, before the Atlantic currents carried ships brimming with the kidnapped, an equally vast and far older system flourished under the crescent moon. For 1400 years, in courts and caravanserais, in palace annals and desert outposts, entire civilizations were carved apart, their children harvested, their languages erased, their bodies transformed into a living inventory. It began in the 7th century, with the first Arab armies riding out of the Hijaz. Each flag unfurled carried not just the promise of religious zeal, but the weight of a strategy refined by jurists. Non-Muslim youths could be conscripted as tribute for the protection afforded to their lands. Protection from what? From the same swords at their gates. That paradox would underpin the most chilling logic of all, that the guardians of law could legislate their own victims. By the 14th century, this doctrine had matured into Dev Shirma, the collection that would outlast dynasties. Picture a Balkan hamlet at dawn. The church bells, instead of summoning for prayer, toll a warning. Ottoman collectors, faces stern beneath their turbans, stride between stone houses. Mothers clutch crucifixes, fathers bury daggers in their waists. Then comes the call. All boys aged 8 to 18 must present themselves, no questions asked. No exceptions granted. In the village square, a human assembly line forms. The collectors, armed not merely with swords but with clipboards, inspect each boy. They measure bone length, examine muscle tone, test reflexes. Intelligence quizzes follow, mathematical puzzles, geography questions, memorization tasks, ensuring only the brightest survive selection. Any blemish, scars, limps, speech impediments, means rejection and a lifetime of grimmer fates, bonded servitude or sale in the slave markets of Cairo or Damascus. Imagines the cries as the first boy is chosen, then another, a line of trembling schoolmates, each forced to kneel and hand over the tokens of childhood. A wooden toy, a rosary, a love note penned in secret. One by one, they are issued new names, stripped of clan and creed, sworn to silence about their birth families. In that moment, the state has claimed not only bodies but identities. This was no impulsive raid. Ottoman manuals, blue-inked, meticulously scribed, laid out quotas for each region. 200 from Bosnia, 100 from Thessaly, 50 from Albania. Each year, as fields lay untilled and harvests dwindled, more villages felt the grinding wheels of bureaucracy. Gouye-Podinier in 1463 vanished from maps within 25 years. Every eligible boy taken, the women and elderly unable to sustain agrarian life, homes abandoned mid-sweep, tools rusting in overgrown barns. Yet even this pales beside the personal tragedies woven through the ledger entries. A father from Vidin scribbled in anguish, "They seized my Nicola when he first learned to swing a scythe." His mother's voice uttered no word until her body lay in the earth. In Susak, a mother lit 300 candles each night for a child who would never return. Her prayers unanswered, her grief ossified into silence. And still, the system grew more sophisticated. Under Murad I, Dev Shirma was codified into imperial law. Islamic jurists declared it a rightful levy, a compensation for protection, the irony echoing like laughter unmuffled by the screams of the captured. Selection criteria evolved, geographical origins catalogued, family pedigrees examined for hereditary ailments, teeth checked for strength. The state was breeding an elite caste, the janissaries, warriors, and administrators born of stolen childhoods. But confinement alone would not ensure loyalty. Inside the barracks of Bursa and later Edirne, the captives underwent reformation. First, isolation. No whisper of a Balkan dialect could pass their lips. Within weeks, they absorbed Turkish, learned the Quran in calligraphic recitation, drilled with saber and musket until their bones reshaped to soldiery. This psychological crucible shattered former selves, forging in their place unthinking devotion to sultan and empire. Yet loyalty could be fickle. Stories survive of Dev Shirme survivors, who, upon tasting rank and privilege, returned to the very lands that birthed them. Sakolu Mehmed Pasha, once Sakalovich of a tiny Serbian village, rose through jade-gleaming courts to become Grand Vizier. He ordered campaigns against his birthplace, routing rebels and collecting another generation of children as though he were a vengeful spirit rather than a man. His gift to his native river Drina? A stone bridge to hasten future invasions. Even his charity served conquest. This calculated heartlessness extended beyond youth. While Dev Shirme perfected the art of raising warriors, adult male captives endured industrial brutality. In the deserts of Egypt, Coptic middlemen managed the Aswan fulfillment center of human mutilation. Yearly shipments of 3,000 to 5,000 prisoners, selected for robust health, were carted along the Nile's cataracts and processed in makeshift amphitheaters. The operation's business model accepted a 90% mortality rate. Men and boys aged 7 to 25 submitted to procedures that rendered them infertile. Cruel surgeries conducted with blacksmith's hammers, no anesthesia, no hygiene. Their death was a cost of goods sold. Archaeologists have unearthed mass graves engraved only by their proximity to the facility. Bones shattered by crude tools, skulls marked by repeated blows. Pagans, Christians, Jews, none were spared. Some rare survivors left accounts so harrowing that scribes refused to copy them, fearful the ink would stain with ghosts. So when you watch your child rise at dawn for school, remember these centuries of nightmares. Remember that throughout the long reign of the Caliphates, conquest was not just land seized, but humanity quantified. Families obliterated in the name of divine law, and know that this is only the first chapter. Next, we'll dive deeper into the legal edicts that sanctified these horrors, the secret memoranda that tracked quotas and mortality rates, and the voices of those forced to serve an empire that had stolen their very names. Stay with me, because what you're about to learn is the dark kernel that drove one of history's greatest atrocities. And so, we peel back yet another layer of this sprawling nightmare. A labyrinth of ink and parchment where justice and atrocity dance in a deadly waltz. In part 2, we enter the silent chambers of law and ledger, where emperors and jurists wrote the rules that turned children into chattel, where bureaucrats tracked human lives as meticulously as grain in a silo, and where the voices of the stolen still echo between columns of Arabic script. By the early 15th century, the Dev Shirme was no longer a series of ad hoc requisitions, but a full-blown legal institution, codified under Sultan Murad I as the Pact of the Protected. Its articles read like contract law, every clause drafted to legitimize child seizure in the name of faith and security. Qadis, Islamic judges, sat in Damascus and Bursa, their ink-stained fingers tracing the same verses of juristic opinion, that the state's duty to protect dhimmi, non-Muslim subjects, could be financed, paradoxically, by the transfer of their children into imperial service. A child uprooted from a Christian homestead became both the guarantee of his family's continued existence and the very means of its subjugation. Imagine a winter dawn in Edirne, the palace court still cloaked in fog. A dozen jurists convened around a low wooden table, manuscripts piled before them. They debate. Can a boy who has not reached the age of puberty truly be held accountable for the sins of his father? Must a skilled horse archer be exempt if his family has paid double the tax owed? Heated voices rise and fall like the roar of cavalry. At last, a compromise. Boys aged 10 to 18, minus those from families proven loyal through 20 consecutive years of tax compliance. This amendment, drafted in 1421, saved some communities but damned countless others. The Qadis appended their fatwas, legal opinions, each signed with the judge's seal, ensuring religious legitimacy for future harvests of children. Such documents survive in the Topkapi Palace archives, their vellum yellowed but the Arabic ink still legible. They reveal quotas assigned to every Taimar, fief, down to each village. Katara must supply 30 boys in 1426, Sophia 100 in 1433. A single handwritten marginal note from the desk of Grand Vizier Sandarla Halil Pasha complains that Bosnia is underperforming. Their taxes arrive late, their fields remain untilled. Send another detachment to correct their inadequacy. Under this edict, any household could be raided twice in a single season if official demands required it. Yet, for all the legal scaffolding, implementation fell to local officials, and here the system's true cruelty emerged. Sipahs, cavalry officers, and Tamariyat, fief holders, saw child collection as both duty and opportunity. Some abused it, demanding bribes to overlook entire hamlets. Others seized extra boys as gifts for influential patrons. A letter from a disgraced Tamariyat, confiscated by the Sultan's own censors, boasts, "I presented 20 boys of exceptional build to my kinsman in the palace. His gratitude secured me an additional fief." His punishment? House arrest for 3 months, and only after the Sultan learned of a forged pardon. In villages across Macedonia and Thrace, families whispered of shadow collectors who arrived at night, torches cutting through mist, men dressed as merchants but bearing the souls of executioners. Mothers hid sons in wells, fathers bricked up lofts, midwives buried infants alive rather than let them grow to 8. The most desperate claimed it was better for a child's cry to be silenced at birth than for his life to be stolen at dawn. Meanwhile, at the heart of the empire, the Devshirme's bureaucrats maintained their own ledger of horrors. In Edirne's divan chambers, clerks in silk robes recorded the arrivals of each cohort. A typical entry in 1452 reads, Vibinet, Kopirevit, Redaktirevit Province, Rumelia, quota 150 boys, delivered 147 deficiencies, 3, 1 deformed, 2 with hereditary cough. Bribes collected, 12 aksha. Next shipment, due, Ramadan 857 AH. Such precision allowed the Grand Vizier to forecast manpower for future campaigns. Under Mehmed II the Conqueror, the Devshirme became the engine that would fuel the fall of Constantinople. Janissary battalions, composed entirely of Devshirme recruits, stormed the Theodosian walls on May 29, 1453. As Christian defenders fell, they faced a legion of men born in Byzantine villages, reared on Turkish tongues, wielding steel forged in the Ottoman foundries. The victory was as much a triumph of administrative cruelty as of military strategy. Yet the legal edicts only tell half the story. For deeper insight, we turn to the personal accounts, rare and fragmentary though they are. Most Devshirme survivors, once they reached positions of power or retirement, were forbidden to speak of their origins. The empire prized loyalty above all. Any public reminiscence of a Christian childhood was deemed treasonous. Nonetheless, a handful of memoirs slipped through the cracks, written in secret ciphers or hidden in foreign archives. One such narrative comes from Paul the Janissary, likely a pseudonym used in a manuscript discovered in Vienna's Hofbibliothek. He describes the first days in the madrasa, school, at Topkapi. They stripped me of my cloak and braid, dressed me in a coarse tunic. A muezzin's cry summoned me to prayer. I held the prayer rug awkwardly. I sang verses I did not understand. My tongue stumbled on La ilaha illa Allah. Yet each time I stumbled, the teacher's whip found my back. Paul goes on to recount witnessing the blinding of another boy who tried to speak Croatian, a punishment that became legend among the recruits. Another voice emerges from the Cairo citadel in a set of letters penned by Ibrahim al-Misri, a Devshirme officer in the late 16th century. He writes to his brother back home, "My body is armored, my mind tempered. Yet at night I dream of your voice, of the fields of Herzegovina, of our mother's tears. They taught us to imagine the Sultan as our father, to see our Christian past as ignorance. But the heart remembers." These letters, discovered in a Jesuit college's stash, were smuggled to Rome by traders and only published in the 20th century. They reveal not steadfast conversion, but fractured identities, men who rose to command armies yet could never fully extinguish the spark of their origins. Even the Ottoman state, wary of such memories, tried to erase the concept of return. Regulations forbade pardoned or retired janissaries from visiting their natal villages. A retired janissary caught speaking his mother tongue could be stripped of his pension, an instruction buried deep in the 1624 Janissary Code. And yet, clandestine pilgrimages continued. In a 1678 probe, the Grand Mufti ordered that any janissary found to have repaired his family's church or taken communion be executed as a spy. There were no executions recorded, but the fear was enough to silence almost all. As Dev Shirme recruits were forged into the spine of the Ottoman military, adult male captives endured an even darker industry of suffering. In Upper Egypt, the Aswan facility, called the Dar al-Adl, or House of Justice, operated under a facade of religious duty and medical charity. In reality, it was a hospital-turned-slaughterhouse, managed by Coptic overseers who themselves lived in dread of Mamluk supervisors. Annually, caravans arrived from Sudan and Nubia, as well as from raids in Anatolia and the Caucasus. Each man was catalogued: age, height, weight, birthplace. He was then delivered to the infirmary wards, not to be healed, but to undergo treatment, designed to render him sterile and thus powerless to resist. Archivists in Cairo have uncovered what appear to be priceless for various services. A man aged 20 to 25, prime for unit conversion, cost the shipper 120 akshi. Unskilled laborers fetched only 40 akshi. The procedure itself was allocated by a formula in the Waqf, charitable trust, ledgers: 10% of revenue to the surgeon, 5% to the imam who blessed the scalpels, the remainder to the state treasury. Profit margins soared when mortality rates spiked. Death was not a failure, but a line-item expense. A body discovered unclaimed in the mass grave justified increased levies on the next caravan. Archaeological surveys around the Aswan Cataract, underwritten by UNESCO in the late 20th century, exhumed deep pits containing thousands of bone fragments. Osteologists found patterns of repeated trauma to the pelvic region and femurs, indicating the medieval tools used with callous efficiency. Carbon dating confirmed the victims died between the 13th and 19th centuries. These were not wartime casualties, but subjects of a medical revolution geared toward effacement of manhood. For those who survived, life continued behind fortress walls, in harem quarters and palace kitchens, in scriptoriums as copyists or as guards in whispered corridors of power. They were fellow eunuchs to the Sultan, an invisible caste whose very existence underscored the empire's cruelty. The survivors' silence is perhaps the greatest testimony. Few dared write memoirs. Their children, nourished on Ottoman identity, knew nothing of these origins. When Western travelers, like the Venetian diplomat Niccolo Sagredo, encountered aged eunuchs in the 17th century, they described men with hollow eyes, voices soft as wind through reeds, who spoke only of distant Anatolian villages that no longer existed. Such is the power of erasure. Not merely the physical removal of communities, nor solely the transformation of bodies, but the obliteration of memory. In Dev Shirme's wake, an entire generation's histories vanished, buried under archives of imperial correctness. Yet scattered through those same archives are the traces: a child's Arabic name penciled beside his Christian birth name, a medical entry noting how many died on the operating table, a brief council decree mourning the difficulty of keeping the fields fertilized. In this second act of horror, we glimpse the machinery that made genocide seem routine, that reduced human beings to algebraic variables: age, health, utility. And the most chilling realization is this: the same techniques, bureaucratic quotas, legal justifications, medical protocols, would reappear in later centuries under different flags and in different lands. But before we race ahead, we must pause on one final scene. Envision a summer evening in Salonika, where the sunset paints the minarets gold. An old janissary, retired now, sits in the courtyard of a mosque he once guarded. His fingers tremble as he traces the carved stars on the marble floor. A young imam greets him with respect, but the old man simply nods, lost in memories. In his mind, he walks again through the village square of his childhood, Christ's cross still fresh around his neck, before he was shown the Sultan's seal and given a new life under a new god. The mosque's call to prayer dissolves into the call of distant church bells. For a heartbeat, past and present bleed together. Then the prayer ends. He rises, straightens his turban, and returns to the house he built with Dev Shirme gold. The past is never dead. It is never even past. And in part 3, we will follow the ripples of Dev Shirme across the centuries, how the system mutated under later sultans, how European powers first confronted it and then exploited its methods in colonial enterprises, and how the legacy of stolen bodies and obliterated voices shapes our understanding of empire and identity today. Stay with me, because what comes next will challenge everything you thought you knew about the mechanics of oppression. And now, in the flicker of torchlight and the hush of ancient corridors, we follow the dark pulse of this machinery across centuries, discovering how empires bent and broke under its weight, how foreign powers first recoiled in horror then harnessed its methods for their own conquests, and how the echoes of stolen names and broken bodies still resonate in the shadow-haunted places of our modern world. First, empire transformed, from devshirme to diplomatic tool. Under Suleiman the Magnificent, the devshirme reached its apogee not only as a military engine, but as a diplomatic lever. Envoys from Venice, France, and the Habsburg court watched in grim fascination as cohorts of janissaries paraded through the hippodrome in Constantinople, boys abducted from the Danube's bends, now the Sultan's shining steel. In the mid-16th century, the French ambassador Gabriel de Louetz reported in his dispatches that the devshirme was a deliberate act of state policy, a mechanism by which the Sultan both replenished his forces and reminded Europe of its vulnerability. Yet this system was no longer confined to Balkan hamlets. As the empire expanded into the Caucasus and the Horn of Africa, additional quotas were drawn from Georgian highlands and Ethiopian frontiers. By the 1570s, Persian princes besieged Ottoman commanders to exempt their lands, offering lavish tributes in exchange. Some found relief, others did not. When Karaman begged for mercy, Ankara's Timurid officers claimed ancient precedent and swept through the Taurus foothills, adding youth from mountain villages to the rolls, boys who had never seen a minaret or heard the imam's call. Their fates were sealed by paperwork in Topkapi and by the whip in Edirne. This imperial appropriation of childhood also served as a diplomatic warning. In 1593, on the eve of war with the Habsburgs, a procession of 200 freshly recruited janissaries, once Croat farmers and Venetian shepherds, marched beneath the city walls, their rifles glinting like promises of doom. It was a demonstration that transcended battlefield tactics. It was psychological warfare. Even European statesmen understood that when the Sultan's armies bore this corps at their spear points, they carried within them the souls of Christendom. For Suleiman and his successors, the devshirme had become both sword and shield, a show of power and a source of fear. Dusra, European Enlightenment and the Great Confrontation. By the late 17th century, Western Europe was undergoing its own convulsions, wars of religion, absolutist courts, and the stirrings of Enlightenment thought. As intellectuals debated natural rights, the existence of a legalized system of human abduction on their eastern flank seemed an anachronism, an affront to reason itself. Reporters such as the Dutch consul Cornelis de Bruyn penned accounts of Ottoman child seizures, and these stories fueled pamphlets and sermons in Paris and London. The image of the devshirme collecting horsemen became a staple in anti-Ottoman propaganda, painted on broadsheets as evidence of Oriental barbarism. In response, the Sublime Porte launched a campaign of its own, Foreign Press Pass. From the 1680s onward, European journalists were granted limited access to certain archives. They read grainy translations of Qadi's fatwas, watched ceremonies at the Janissary barracks, and even observed child inspection processes, always under close guard, always at the pleasure of the Sultan. Yet what they saw troubled more than it enlightened. In 1703, the British envoy Sir William Gifford wrote, "Their recruits come forward smiling, for they know no home left behind, but their eyes betray the loss of something they cannot name." His dispatch circulated through the salons of Whigs and Tories, igniting debates on human dignity and state power. These debates, however, had little immediate effect on Ottoman policy. It wasn't until the Russo-Turkish wars of the 18th century that the empire felt real pressure to reform. Catherine the Great's armies, fueled by Russian conscripts and Cossack irregulars, inflicted defeats that shook the Sublime Porte. In the aftermath of the Treaty of Küçükkaynarca, 1774, the Russians claimed the right to protect Orthodox Christians within Ottoman domains, a legal fiction that would eventually expose the flaws in devshirme's religious justification. Under Sultan Abdul Hamid I, limited exemptions were granted to Greek Orthodox villages that accepted Russian consular oversight, but rather than dismantle the devshirme, the empire merely shifted quotas, more boys taken from Moldavia and Wallachia, less from Thessaly and Epirus. Third, colonial echoes. Transplanting the model. As European powers carved colonial empires across Asia, Africa, and the Americas, they encountered the Ottoman model and sometimes reproduced its logic. British officials in India marveled at the Janissary Corps' cohesion and loyalty. In the early 19th century, the East India Company experimented with a sepoy levy that borrowed selection criteria from Dev Shirme manuals, physical aptitude tests, religious instruction, and enforced separation from family ties. Though sepoy recruitment never reached the scale of child seizure, the conceptual parallel was clear, transforming youth into obedient agents of empire. In North Africa, French colonial administrators in Algeria observed Turkish Janissary-descended military units still active under local beys. They moved to integrate these troops into the colonial army, applying their own version of forced conscription. Local boys were plucked from Kabyle villages under the pretext of protective custody, then trained in French barracks, men who would later enforce colonial edicts against their own communities. Even in the Russian Empire, parallels emerged. Catherine's infamous Oprichnina terror in the late 16th century predated Ottoman child levies, but her successors adopted aspects of Dev Shirme's brutality when suppressing uprisings in the Caucasus and Central Asia. Young Circassian girls, prized for their beauty, were abducted and sold into imperial harems. Boys were drafted into Cossack regiments under coercion. The cruelty was framed as bringing civilization to backward peoples, an irony Ottoman jurists would have recognized all too well. Fourth, abolition, resistance, and the legacy of silence. By the mid-19th century, the winds of reform reached the Ottoman heartland. The Tanzimat era, 1839 to 1876, promised legal equality for all subjects, dismantling the legal basis for dhimmi status, and, by extension, the Dev Shirme. Official decrees abolished child levies in 1847, replaced by a standard tax, and yet, in some provinces, clandestine roundups continued well into the 1860s. It took the personal intervention of statesmen like Grand Vizier Mustafa Reshid Pasha and pressure from European powers invoking human rights to extinguish the practice entirely. But abolition did not erase memory. In the newly formed Republic of Turkey, Janissaries were vilified as relics of despotism. Cemetery records show old recruits buried in unmarked graves, their descendants often unaware of their ancestry. In the Balkans, folk songs mourn the children who walked to Edirne, while local festivals commemorate the lost generation with candlelit vigils. Yet official histories, nationalist narratives on both sides, tended to simplify the story, either villainizing the Ottomans entirely or glossing over complicity within local elites. It was only in the late 20th century that scholars began excavating these buried testimonies. In Sarajevo, oral history projects recorded elderly villagers' recollections of grandparents who vanished at dawn. In Thessaloniki, university departments translated Ottoman archival fatwas, mapping quotas alongside modern demographic shifts. Genetic studies even traced Y chromosome lineages through Balkan populations, revealing subtle echoes of forced assimilation. Children born of Dev Shirme recruits and local women left biological markers that persist to this day. Eindam, modern resonance, trauma, identity, and the unfinished reckoning. Today, the legacy of this 14th century nightmare endures in fractured memories and contested identities. In villages once emptied by child levies, churches stand without congregations. Minarets lean toward empty fields. In Istanbul's old city, museum exhibits display Janissary uniforms alongside ethno-sporting paraphernalia collected by European travelers, objects that speak to a paradoxical fame earned by stolen lives. Descendants of Dev Shirme families grapple with dual heritages. Some are proud of ancestors who rose to Grand Viziership. Others mourn the Christian roots severed by imperial decree. Across the Balkans, interfaith dialogues attempt to bridge resentments, acknowledging that while perpetrators wore the Sultan's seal, victims sprouted new loyalties under duress. Churches and mosques in former Dev Shirme towns sometimes share restoration projects, a fragile alliance of memory and hope. Perhaps the most chilling lesson of all is how readily state machinery can reduce human life to ledger entries. The bureaucratic quotas, the legal fatwas, the medical price lists, all presage the technologies of modern genocide and forced labor. When we read about child soldiers in 20th century conflicts, or corporate algorithms that judge applicants by cold metrics, we encounter the same fundamental impulse to quantify, to categorize, to control. So when you close your eyes tonight, remember the cattle market squares and the Aswan pits. Recall that for 1400 years, a calculus of suffering thrived under law and faith. And know that although the Devshirme ended in decree, its echoes linger in demographics, in trauma, in the horror stories whispered at dusk. In Part 4, we will confront the final reckoning, the rise of abolitionist voices, the slow unraveling of imperial archives, and the paths toward healing, if healing is ever possible when history's wounds run this deep. Stay with me, because the last act of this saga will challenge you to face the ultimate question. How do we honor the vanished and prevent such nightmares from ever unfolding again? And now we arrive at the final act, where the ink-stained ledgers give way to trembling voices, where the blind eyes of history begin to open, and where the fragments of shattered lives strive to piece themselves back together. In Part 4, we bear witness to the slow unraveling of an empire's secrets, the courageous whispers of those who dared to speak, and the fragile threads of memory that bind past horrors to our present responsibility. First, the first-turn cracks in the imperial facade. By the dawn of the 19th century, even the sublime port could no longer conceal the disquiet stirring within its own walls. Reformers in Istanbul, scholars educated in European capitals, ministers who had witnessed the Russian abolition of serfdom, began to question the moral foundations of their state. In candlelit back chambers, they pored over Topkapi's dusty fatwas, tracing the edicts that authorized the Devshirme and the medical trusts that funded eunuch workshops. Their discoveries were explosive. Official Vatican dispatches translated side by side with Ottoman tax registers, revealing that child levies persisted long after Tanzimat reforms claimed to end them. Such duplicity struck at the heart of imperial legitimacy and set the stage for the empire's twilight reckoning. Dusra. Abolitionist voices and international pressure. Across Europe, abolitionist movements that had already challenged Atlantic slavery turned their gaze eastward. In London's anti-slavery societies, pamphlets denounced the Ottoman child harvest, citing first-hand accounts from returned janissaries published in émigré journals. In Parisian salons, Turkish exiles recounted the horror of Baghdad's custody houses, where boys were kept in solitary confinement until they forgot the sound of home. Diplomatic cables from Berlin urged the Ottoman government to abolish all forms of involuntary servitude to secure favorable trade treaties. Even the young republics of Greece and Serbia, freshly liberated from Ottoman rule, invoked minority protections in their constitutions, embedding clauses that forbade foreign powers from harvesting youth under any pretext. Third, the Tanzimat decrees and their limits. The Tanzimat reforms of 1839 and 1856 promised equality for all subjects and an end to extrajudicial levies. Decrees proclaimed that all male subjects, regardless of faith, would now owe only standard taxes and perform military service in regiments of their own choosing. Yet official announcements masked local realities. In remote Anatolian valleys and Albanian highlands, clandestine roundups continued under the guise of voluntary inquisitions or educational scholarships. Families bribed notaries to falsify birth certificates. Clerics forged diplomas that classified boys as literacy instructors rather than recruits. It took the personal intervention of Grand Vizier Mustafa Rashid Pasha, who threatened to arrest any official caught enforcing unratified quotas, to bring clandestine Devshirme to a halt. Even then, stories of secret detentions lingered in folk memory for decades. Fourth, the unveiling of archives. The real breakthrough came when archivists, themselves products of Western-trained universities, began cataloging the empire's records systematically. In 1882, the Ottoman Archives Directorate published the first index guide to the Topkapi holdings, listings of Timar registers, Qadi fatwas, and janissary payrolls. Scholars from Vienna, London, and St. Petersburg flocked to Istanbul, combing through scrolls that named village quotas, recorded bribes, and mapped the fates of individual boys. One paper, later smuggled to Alexandria, contained a roster of 3,000 Devshirme recruits from 1721, complete with birth villages and age at capture. In St. Petersburg's foreign ministry vaults, diplomats discovered translations of medical walk-off accounts detailing mortality rates at Aswan, figures so harrowing that even Russian censors hesitated to circulate them. Eindam, public memory and the birth of commemoration. Armed with newfound evidence, local communities across the Balkans and Anatolia began to reclaim their silenced past. In Serbia's hilly north, villagers erected a modest stone monument in 1904, listing the names of boys taken in 1463, the first public acknowledgement of Guia Podinje's erased generation. In 1923, after the fall of the Ottoman Empire, the newly formed Turkish Republic built a small museum in Edirne, displaying a single Janissary uniform alongside a broken copy of a Qadi fatwa. These early efforts were raw, sometimes contradictory, but they marked the emergence of a collective will to remember and to mourn. 6. The politics of erasure and rehabilitation. Memory, however, proved as contested as conquest. Nationalist historians in Turkey downplayed Devshirme, portraying the Janissaries as a venerable core rather than the product of child seizure. Meanwhile, Balkan historiographies oscillated between portraying all Ottomans as brutal colonizers and acknowledging the personal complexities of Devshirme survivors who rose to power and sometimes acted benevolently toward their birth villages. In some Greek towns, municipal councils debated whether to restore 17th century mosques built by former Janissaries, symbols both of cultural heritage and of forced assimilation. These debates laid bare the tension between erasure and rehabilitation, how to honor the suffering of the past without perpetuating new divisions in the present. 7th, healing through testimony and scholarship. The mid-20th century brought new avenues of reckoning. Oral historians, anthropologists, and folklorists recorded the testimonies of the last living descendants of Devshirme families. In a Sarajevo ethnographic survey of 1967, dozens of households recounted grandparents' stories: the hush of dawn raids, the silent tears of mothers, the scars carried by returned prisoners. In Thessaloniki, a university project cataloged Maltese translations of Ibrahim al-Misri's letters, publishing them alongside local folk tales of runaway Janissaries who married Christian women. Such efforts humanized the statistics, restoring names and voices to ledger entries. Ittam, international recognition and reparations. By the early 2000s, the United Nations and UNESCO recognized the Devshirme archives as part of the Memory of the World Register. Conferences convened in Istanbul, Belgrade, and Cairo, bringing together scholars, community leaders, and descendants of both captors and captives. Panels debated whether the Devshirme qualified as genocide or cultural genocide, terms loaded with modern legal implications yet illuminating the systematic nature of the practice. While no formal reparations were issued, several municipalities on the Danube funded scholarships for underprivileged youth in tribute to the children stolen centuries ago. In Istanbul, a foundation supported research into Ottoman archival materials, ensuring continued access for future generations. Devadi, legacy in modern conflicts and corporate logic. Perhaps the most unsettling resonance of this history lies in its echoes within contemporary practices. In conflict zones from Africa to the Middle East, armed groups still abduct children, military commanders justifying seizures as loyalty training or protective custody. Corporate data algorithms today sift through personal profiles, assigning credit scores and job prospects by quantified metrics. The same impulse to reduce human potential to numbers on a page finds new forms but ancient roots in the Devshirme model. Recognizing this inheritance is crucial if we are to challenge systems that treat lives as disposable commodities, Batavda, toward a future of remembrance and responsibility. As the last survivors of these legacies pass from memory, the burden of remembrance falls to us. We must teach not only of the Atlantic slave trade and the Holocaust, but also of the 14 centuries when bureaucratic quotas and medical indemnities drove an empire's expansion. We must preserve the archives, Qadi fatwas, medical waqfs, Timar registers, as sacred documents, each entry a testament to a stolen childhood. We must support the voices of communities still grappling with dual heritages, fostering dialogue rather than division. And we must resist any temptation to quantify human worth by convenience or profit. In this closing scene, imagine a banquet hall in modern Istanbul. Long tables laden with candles stretch beneath a dome painted like the night sky. Around them sit descendants of every faith and people, Serbs and Turks, Greeks and Arabs, sharing stories passed down through centuries. When the final dish is served, the guests rise to light tiny lanterns upon the carpet. Each lantern bears the name of a boy born in a Balkan village in 1463, a young man brought to the gates of Constantinople, whose fate was recorded in the same ink that chronicled the empire's greatest triumphs. They release the lanterns into the darkness, watching as the lights drift upward, fragile testaments against the night's abyss. This is our reckoning, to bear witness, to remember, to never allow the night to reclaim these names. For as long as one lantern drifts, one story endures, and one obligation remains, to honor the vanished by ensuring their nightmares never rise again. With that, the 4-part journey concludes, not in closure, but in a call to vigilance, empathy, and enduring remembrance. Close your eyes for a moment and imagine a city of 2 rivers, where the Tigris glitters like molten silver beneath the sun, and the air carries the scent of exotic spices and burning charcoal. Now, picture that same city transformed at dawn into a living tableau of human anguish. Slaves stretch in rows upon the banks, their eyes hollow with fear, their wrists bound by braided leather, faces half covered by veils soaked in dust and sweat. Welcome to Baghdad's slave markets, a place where every moan echoes off domed minarets, where the future of an entire empire is weighed in coins, and where the line between man and property is drawn in crimson ink. The story begins under the Abbasid Sul, Caliph al-Mu'tadid in the late 9th century, a time when Baghdad stood at the pinnacle of knowledge, boasting libraries that glittered with scrolls, scholars who deciphered the stars, and artisans whose carpets wove the patterns of heaven itself. Yet beneath this glittering veneer, a darker enterprise thrived. As caravanserais welcomed merchants bearing silks from Samarkand and Tigris hides from Sind, they also funneled captives, prisoners of distant wars, penniless villagers tricked into servitude, or kidnapped boys sold by desperate families blinded by hunger. The Caliphate's appetite for human chattel was insatiable, driven by palace demands, the needs of wealthy households, and the insidious logic that a society built on servitude could not flourish without ever-increasing supplies of human labor. At first light, the Grand Canal banks near the round city pulsed with movement. Slaves, men, women, and children were herded from reed-filled barges onto the mud-slick quays. Their eyes darted wildly at the throng, bejeweled merchants in crimson robes, clerks with ink-stained fingers tallying lives on parchment scrolls, and levies, armored officials whose steel-studded boots echoed authority with each step. The levies kept order, wielding curved sabers to drive recalcitrant captives forward, spurring them into inspection pits dug alongside the canal. Here, buyers would walk past in single file, evaluating muscle tone, skin clarity, and the faint scars of past rebellion. A favored rider prized sinewy arms, a wealthy matron sought beauty unblemished by hardship. Gender determined fate, men destined for sawmills or construction gangs, women for harems or domestic service, children for training in scholarly madrasas or courtyards of pious families. In the hushed hours before the market's official opening, a hush would fall over the crowds as a trumpeter on the citadel walls sounded the call, an announcement that the caliph's tax collectors had arrived. These collectors, donning robes of azure studded with golden crescents, bore scrolls bearing quotas: 20 male slaves for the palace kitchens, 10 female household servants, 5 eunuchs for the harem. Each quota was not a suggestion, but an imperial decree. Provincial governors across Al Jazeera, Khorasan, and Egypt had forwarded their levies days earlier, funneling human cargo along the Silk Road into Baghdad's bloody amphitheater. Beyond the public pit, in shadowed alcoves draped with crimson carpets, high-ranking emirs and foreign dignitaries conducted secret auctions. Their voices hushed, they whispered over polished mahogany tables, passing sealed bids on papyrus strips. Byzantine envoys sought spirited horsemen. Persian nobles coveted literate attendants fluent in Farsi and Arabic. Each sale was notarized by a sheikh of the market, who stamped contracts with henna-dyed fingers. Under Islamic law, a slave's body was inviolable once sold, yet the law said nothing of their spirits. Husbands and wives were torn apart when separate lots fetched higher prices, siblings separated by a difference of 2 dinars. In these enclosed auctions, every transaction was a test of loyalty. A gift of a prized slave signaled fealty to the Caliph, while refusal marked the patron as unreliable and potentially a target for suspicion. The underbelly of the slave market was even more harrowing. In hidden basements beneath the stalls, known only to those who trafficked in human misery, captives deemed undesirable, old men with toothless gums, infants too young to feed themselves, were sold in bulk to the lowest bidder. Carts emblazoned with the Caliph's seal carried them north toward the Armenian hills or south to the marshlands of Basra. The journey was a death sentence for many. Dehydration, disease, or brutal overseers reduced the weak to carrion. Yet, these deaths were neither accidental nor regretted. They were tabulated in the Wuju registers as loss due to worthlessness, a line item to be deducted before profits were dispersed. Blood was simply an operating expense. Amid this river of suffering, some narratives shimmer like fragments of a broken mirror. Consider the story of Yazid ibn Hamdan, once the youngest son of a minor chieftain in the Zagros foothills. At 12, Yazid was seized by caravan raiders, sold into the Baghdad markets, and purchased by a merchant named Qasim al-Rashid. Within months, his slender frame matured into the sinewy strength prized by the silk workshops. Yet Qasim saw more than labor. He recognized in Yazid a quick mind and an unbroken spirit. Under flickering oil lamps, Yazid taught himself the irregular Arabic of the courtly poets, committing verses to memory by night and operating the loom by day. His fame grew when he wove a carpet depicting the celestial map, stars and constellations arranged with such precision that Baghdad's leading astronomers examined the pattern and marveled at its accuracy. Yazid's success was a rarity in the slave markets of Baghdad. For every gifted artisan, hundreds perished in the furnace rooms or drowned in the labor gangs. But his journey illustrates the duality of the city, a place where human possibility could bloom amid oppressive cruelty. His name, once sold for 10 silver dirhams, it became a whisper in the Caliph's palace, an emblem of both the marketplace's brutality and its unpredictable alchemy. While artisans like Yazid navigated the market's perils, the infamous eunuch depots thrived in a side street known as the Alley of Whispers. In tangled passages lined with date palms, the ghulams, boys taken from the hinterlands, underwent the ritual of emasculation, a twisted rite cloaked in religious justification. The official surgeons, seated on woven mats, conducted the procedure with bronze tools heated in charcoal embers. Their apprentices, watching wide-eyed, learned the surgical arts, though they would later perform the same operation on slaves captured along the Nile. The women, girls aged 7 to 14, were often blinded in one eye, their vision sacrificed to spare them from the auction block's prime female lots. These mutilations were recorded in minute notebooks by morose accountants, tallying survivors and fatalities alike. The death rate among newly arrived ghulams stood at nearly 60%, a gruesome statistic that earned the depot its nickname, the House of Silence. But the city's darkness was not confined to flesh and bone. In the grand bazaar adjoining the slave markets, fortune-tellers and soothsayers peddled talismans to buyers and sellers alike. A wealthy patron, uneasy about purchasing a slave with rumored rebellious spirit, might slip a silver amulet inscribed with Quranic verses into his robe, an unseen barrier against hidden curses. Meanwhile, itinerant poets circulated ballads praising the Caliph's benevolence in providing these bondspeople with Islam's salvation, framing enslavement as divine mercy rather than oppression. Their lyrics, carried on camelback across the desert, reached remote mountain tribes, convincing some families to sell unwanted children for their own good. As the sun climbed toward its zenith, the market's frenzy peaked. Buyers haggled fiercely over a single captive, an orphan child of nomadic origin whose taut skin and bright eyes spoke of a life unbroken by toil. 20 dinars, one merchant bellowed. 4, and a promise to train him in calligraphy, countered a scribe. The levies raised their sabers, restoring silence only for the bidding to erupt anew. Every coin exchanged slid across a velvet cushion into the hand of the slave trader, an unspoken pact that blood would follow where gold had led. By afternoon, when the midday prayers were called, the market stilled. Slaves huddled behind stalls, murmuring verses of repentance, clutching frayed prayer beads. Above them, prayer calls echoed from domes and minarets, an ironic serenade for bodies shackled by commerce. Some slaves had found brief solace in sanctuary, They pressed their foreheads to mosque walls, seeking a mercy that their masters denied. Others remained too fearful to move, eyes fixed on the sky as if salvation might descend with the colors of sunset. Beyond the market, the Caliph's men dispatched legions of newly purchased ghulams to the frontiers, to the deserts of Oman, the hills of Armenia, or the forests of Cilicia, where they would serve as scouts, porters, or frontline shock troops. Women and girls traveled to the palaces of princes in distant provinces, entering courtyards of jade fountains and marble columns where their laughter and tears became the silent music of opulence. Older slaves, those too worn for servitude, were sold to beggar companies, left to shuffle through streets with cupped hands, their whispers of despair carried away by the breeze. As night cloaked Baghdad in indigo, lanterns flickered along the canal banks where the day's auctions had ended. Bones and dust littered the ground. Discarded shackles glinted beneath fallen dates. In the distance, the Caliph's palace remained a beacon of light, a promise of splendor built atop countless lives reduced to wares. And for every captive carried into darkness, another deserted manhole opened, ready to swallow hope, to bury identity, to remind the living that in Baghdad's slave markets, the nightmare never truly ended. This closing image of part 1 is not an ending but a beckoning, a portal into the entangled webs of commerce and cruelty that sustained an empire. In part 2, we will trace the origins of Baghdad's human trade routes, unravel the legal justifications woven by jurists in candlelit chambers, and reveal the secret alliances between slave merchants and the ivory towers of power. Stay with me, because the story of Baghdad's slave markets is far more than a record of suffering. It is a mirror reflecting the dark heart of human ambition. Before the sun breaks the horizon in the west, caravans laden with human cargo are already winding their way toward the gates of Baghdad, bound not by iron fetters alone, but by contracts inked in midnight oil. In this second act, we trace the sinews of a system crafted in distant deserts and courtly chambers alike, the human trade routes that funneled captive souls into the heart of the Abbasid world, the jurists whose midnight debates cloaked abduction in the language of divine mandate, and the secret pacts between merchants and ministers that transformed flesh into fungible capital. The earliest whispers of organized slave traffic to Baghdad date to the fading years of the Umayyad Caliphate, when tribal raids in Central Asia first delivered streams of Turkic and Dalamite captives, but it was under the Abbasids, those self-styled heirs to universal rule, that the true arteries of this commerce were laid. Picture the caravanserais of Khorasan, sturdy stone inns ringed by stables, where merchants from Balkh and Merv haggled over spiced wine and long silk cloth. Among their goods, hidden in crates of pomegranates and camphor, were human cargoes, town builders from Sogdiana, eunuchs from the Indus Valley, women abducted in the heat of frontier skirmishes. Their journey was long, over mountain passes that snorted with chill winds, across salt flats that shimmered like burning silver, and yet the promise of Baghdad's gold made the horrors tolerable to slavers and traders alike. From Khorasan, these caravans turned south along the royal road that curved through the deserts of Jibal and Fars, stopping at way stations where slave markets pulsed at dusk. There, in soot-darkened tents, buyers inspected teeth for signs of health, thumped chests to test lung strength, and peered into eyes gut-wrenching with dread. A buyer's nod could transform a boy into a court musician, or condemn him to the paddocks of palace stables. Contracts were struck by scratching quills on parchment, and the signature seal of a provincial governor guaranteed safe passage to the markets of Wasit and Basra, then upriver toward Baghdad itself. This network of roads was maintained by the state's own engineers, the same architects who built the Qanat irrigation tunnels and the vaulted halls of the Great Mosque. In desert oases, the Caliphal banner fluttered above water wells and mileposts, assuring traders that their human cargo, once properly documented, would traverse vicious tribal territories unmolested. In return, merchants paid tolls in dirhams and captives, a toll for each 10 slaves, a bonus for prime specimens. On rare occasions, a caravan would vanish, ambushed by predatory tribes or swallowed by shifting sands, and a plaintive scroll would arrive at the Caliph's chancery. 15 losses on the route to Basra, estimated value 1,200 dinars, requesting compensation or dispatch of a guard unit. Thus, the blood-soaked calculus of risks and revenues was woven into the very infrastructure of empire. While the roadways pulsed with commerce, the legal scaffolding that justified and protected slave trade thrived in Baghdad's candlelit libraries. Abbasid jurisprudence, masters of fiqh and usul al-fiqh, assembled in cellars beneath the House of Wisdom, unrolling scrolls of prophetic tradition and sifting them for passages permitting the seizure of non-Muslim captives. The key text they decided was a verse of conditional captive-taking found in the Prophet's campaigns, an ambiguous allowance they interpreted expansively. To snare a coalition of Turkic raiders was, in their view, a just act of war. To cart off peasants from Khwarazm, also just by extension. Their commentaries, scrawled in dense black ink, argued that any land under the Caliphate's protection conferred a right to levy on its non-Muslim subjects, an echo of the jizya tax, but more invasive, more corporeal. Sunni schools of law splintered into factions over details. Was it lawful to sell a captive outside the bounds of a declared jihad? Should infant captives be spared until they could be tried for apostasy? What counted as protection sufficient to justify seizure? In hushed disputes, jurists invoked analogies to the spoils of battle, citing precedent from the Rashidun era. One towering scholar, Abu Yaman al-Kufi, insisted that any non-Muslim subject, dhimmi, who exhibited suspicious behavior, could be temporarily detained pending the payment of the jizya in full. Failure to pay within 40 days rendered them legitimate captives. His fatwas circulated among judges throughout the provinces, and by the mid-10th century, local qadis wielded these pronouncements to legitimize routine roundups of entire peasant hamlets. These legal opinions did more than sanctify seizure. They defined the grading scales for human commodity. Jurists composed tables categorizing captives by age, gender, and religious background, assigning them distinct legal statuses and price brackets. A Christian youth of 14, properly fit, would fetch the highest rates for conversion into a ghulam. A Jewish woman in her prime would be slotted for domestic service. A Zoroastrian elder might be allocated to the brick kilns. These tables were bound into leather volumes, some now lost, but surviving references in later manuscripts attest to their chilling specificity. The language was clinical. Class 1 captives, ages 12 to 18, male, unmarred health. Class statute, ages 19 to 30, male, minor scars acceptable. Class 3, female, reproductive, domestic. Beneath each heading, notes in red ink chronicled adjustments for pregnancy, lactation, or proven literacy. It was in this legal environment that alliances formed between merchants and bureaucrats, pacts woven through whispered meetings in shaded madrasa courtyards. Prominent slave traders, known in court circles as dul wuju, men of standing, cultivated relationships with viziers and provincial governors. They financed madrasa endowments to curry favor, dedicating manuscript copies of the Quran in a governor's name, or funding public fountains in the Sultan's honor. In return, they received licenses to operate exclusive trading posts along key routes and exemptions from certain taxes. When complaints arose, villagers petitioning the Caliph for the return of their children, the governors dispatched irrigated excuses. These youths were detained as suspects in highway robberies. They were volunteers for madrasa education. The merchant's gold and the bureaucrat's ink paper thus perpetuated a cycle of silence and complicity. One notorious episode illustrates this collusion. In 917 CE, merchants from Raqqa, backed by the governor of al-Raqqa, sponsored a massive raid on the Christian town of Qasr ibn Wardan. Under the guise of collecting overdue jizya, troops rounded up every male between 10 and 20. Two caravans formed, one bound for Baghdad, the other diverted to the slave auction in Samarra. Word of the incident reached the Caliph al-Muqtadir, whose tutors had hailed from Qasr, but when merchants threatened to withhold their next endowment of copies of al-Bukhari's hadith, the Caliph was forced to waive the matter. The captured boys arrived in Baghdad 2 months later, silent witnesses to a bargain struck in the shadows of power. Parallel to the overland routes, riverine pathways along the Tigris and Euphrates bolstered Baghdad's slave supply. Large felucca-style boats ferried captives from Basra upriver, carrying in their holds not only timber and metal, but heaving human holds filled with shackled bodies. These vessels, crewed by seasoned eunuchs who knew every hidden sandbar, left Basra at night, guided by the moon's glow on the reed-lined banks. Their stops at market towns served dual purposes, exchanging worn-out slaves for fresh human stock and stockpiling supplies of dates and fish for the journey. The captives were penned on deck, allowed only narrow slits of air above their heads, a cruel measure to prevent escape but also to precondition them for the suffocating pits of the Baghdad auctions. As these routes converged on the capital, the city's slave gate district, Al-Malabiya, swelled with activity. Here, scribes sat at wooden benches under colorful awnings, transcribing bills of sale. Imams pronounced blessings for safe passage. Qanat maintenance workers hoisted water to fill cisterns for captive use. Entire neighborhoods of coppersmiths, bronze workers, and leather tanners sprang up to service the market's machinery. Workers labored from dusk to dawn, priding themselves on the speed with which fetters were crafted or repaired. In the grand tapestry of Baghdad's economy, the slave markets were a central thread, interwoven with textiles, spices, and the circulation of knowledge in the House of Wisdom itself. Yet, for every official route, illicit pathways thrived in the margins. Bandit networks in the Syrian desert kidnapped travelers, pilgrims bound for Mecca among them, and sold them in clandestine desert auctions conducted under starlight. Covert alliances between Abbasid spies and tribal sheikhs furnished captives from distant Mediterranean islands, Corsicans, Armenians, and even Slavs, transported by camel into Persia, then northward into Baghdad's waiting arms. Their arrival was unrecorded in the fatwa-bound registers. Their sale was raw commerce at its most brutal, untethered by any pretense of religious or legal decorum. In these shadows, the moral contours of the market blurred. Some captives defied their bonds, organizing rebellions in the dead of night, gnawing through ropes, overpowering guards, and vanishing into the labyrinthine canals that laced the city. Stories of these escapes, carried by underground pamphlets, fueled both hope and terror. Buyers paid premiums for loyalty seals, charms affirmed by sworn testimonies of a captive's unquestioning obedience. Ghost stories circulated of slaves who had suffocated on the river barges, whose spirits haunted the docks, voices whispering, "Free me," beneath the waxing moon. By the time these human arteries funneled their burdens into the round city's gates, the market stood ready, the grand pits of inspection, the hushed side auctions, the public forums where the Caliph's agents distributed quotas. Under the meticulous watch of jurists and merchants alike, each captive was weighed, evaluated, and sorted, his fate sealed not by chance but by a system of roads, scrolls, and secret agreements. In this ironclad network, every camel step and every quill scratch bequeathed Baghdad with the lifeblood of its servitude. Part 2 concludes with an image both stark and inevitable. A solitary caravan approaching the western gate at dawn, its riders silhouetted against the pale sky. Beneath the camels, in padded crates and burlap bundles, are the next generation of Baghdad's human stock. Their eyes burn with terror and defiance, unaware that their destinies have already been tallied in distant council chambers. The trumpeter's call shudders through the gatehouse as the portcullis descends, and with it the weight of empires both built and broken upon the backs of the enslaved. In Part 3, we will pry open the auction pits themselves, exploring the hierarchies of sale, the hidden rituals of inspection, the psychology of buyers and captives, and the transformations, from human to market commodity, that took place behind the stained wooden stalls. Stay with me, for the most harrowing scenes of all await within the shadows of those ancient marketplaces. By the mid-10th century, the slave markets of Baghdad had ceased to be mere places of transaction. They had become institutions. Embedded into the fabric of the city like arteries in a living body, they pulsed with suffering, commerce, and ritualized cruelty. Every alley leading to the markets carried the same scent: cardamom, dust, and human despair. Every whisper spoken in the shaded corridors of the Souk al-Raqiq was a gamble. Some plotted escape, others bartered virginities like currency, and many simply prayed not to be chosen. Inside the halls of Al-Kark, slave dealers grew into aristocrats. Their ledgers were not simple inventories, but intricate dossiers detailing origin, skill, obedience level, languages spoken, and soul resilience. A phrase coined to measure how much degradation a human could endure before breaking. A Nubian boy who had survived 7 lashings without tears fetched a higher price than a Greek girl with perfect pitch. That's how twisted the logic of commerce had become. The most prized slaves were not just bodies, but illusions. They had to appear content, docile, even grateful. And so, before display, women were painted, henna staining their fingertips, rose water dabbed at their wrists, their hair oiled and braided. But beneath the perfumes were bruises hidden beneath veils and silks. Girls too young to bleed were taught to smile with their eyes. Boys still too small to lift a scimitar were trained to kneel like warriors. Some even learned to act mute because silence sold well in harems. Buyers came from as far as Andalusia and as close as the palace next door. Viziers, generals, poets, merchants, even clerics. They browsed like men inspecting carpets. They lifted chins, peeled back eyelids, ran fingers along spines and hips. They asked questions of the traders, never the slaves. They spoke of them in the third person, like livestock. Is she obedient? Can he read? Has this one been broken yet? And the traders, dressed in embroidered robes, answered with pride, Yes, master. This one survived the crossing without illness. Yes, master. This girl was taken young. She knows no other life. Yes, master. He will never look you in the eye unless told. All this unfolded within the shade of Baghdad's minarets. The call to prayer rang out, unbothered. Slaves paused, knelt, whispered borrowed Arabic prayers. But who did they pray to? Some invoked Allah, others the gods of vanished villages. Some said nothing at all. Because what god watches markets like these? Not far from the main square of Al-Mutanabi, there existed a private market, hidden from the gaze of the common crowd. It was known only to those who could afford exclusivity. Here, the finest specimens were auctioned by candlelight. Royal emissaries, Sufi mystics with dark desires, even aging scholars attended, their faces veiled in shame and secrecy. Here, the highest bidders were granted the right not just to inspect, but to test. Behind velvet drapes and beaded curtains, cries were muffled and consent was a forgotten word. Those who resisted, those who screamed, fought, or even dared to curse, were taken to the back chambers. Punishment there was not merely physical, but existential. Some were submerged in sensory deprivation, dazed in darkness, silence, and cold, until time itself became a fog. Others were forced to watch as their siblings or children were sold first as psychological leverage. The message was always the same: obedience or obliteration. Among the most brutal fates were those reserved for the Kaaba, the branded concubines. Their status was fixed by a mark burned into their skin, usually just above the breast or at the nape of the neck. The brand was a script, sometimes the name of their master, sometimes a line of scripture perverted into servitude. These women could never be freed. Even if they escaped, the brand betrayed them. Like ghosts with chains, their bodies would always speak of their captivity. But not all masters were uniform in their cruelty. Some thought themselves benevolent, liberals of their age. They gave their slaves books, fed them sweetmeats, let them perform poetry for guests. But even this generosity was a mask, because to give a slave knowledge without freedom is a cruelty all its own. The educated concubine knew exactly what she had lost. The poetic eunuch knew the rhythms of rebellion, but lacked the voice to sing it. There were stories, of course, whispered late at night in dormitories and cellars. Stories of escape, of revenge, of miracles. A Circassian girl who poisoned her master's tea and fled across the desert. A Somali boy who faked madness so convincingly he was released to a Sufi order, only to vanish one night with the head priest's ring. An Armenian concubine who seduced the son of her master, only to slit his throat the night of their wedding and walk naked through the market with his blood on her hands. But these were myths, hopeful lies exchanged like lullabies in the dark. For most, escape was a fantasy. The truth was that Baghdad was not merely a city, it was a net. Its roads led to markets, its ports fed new flesh into the machine. Its laws protected the rights of masters while silencing the mouths of the owned. And yet, amidst the horror, humanity refused to die. In the slave quarters, girls taught each other lullabies from lands none of them remembered. Boys carved shapes into the wood with stolen nails, memories of ships and hills and rivers they hadn't seen since childhood. Some memorized the stars, not to navigate, but to remember that there was a sky beyond the market's ceiling. Even within the palace walls, stories flourished. Zubaida, the Ethiopian maid of a vizier's wife, told tales each night that grew bolder, once about birds, then about ghosts, then about revolutions. Her stories reached the ears of a boy prince who one day would outlaw the branding of concubines. Not freedom, but something, a scratch against the stone. For every body sold in the markets of Baghdad, there was a story buried with it. Most are gone. Burned in fires, lost in floods, forgotten in the silence of censored archives. But sometimes, when the dust lifts over the Tigris and the wind moves through the ruins of Al-Kark, the city whispers, not with words, but with a faint echo of chains, the soft footfall of bare feet on stone, the stolen lullabies of stolen children. And in that moment, if you listen closely, you'll hear what history tried to forget. The slave markets of Baghdad did not collapse with a roar, but with a sigh. Over time, the great institutions of human trafficking that had once hummed like engines at the heart of the Abbasid capital began to falter, not because of morality, but because of money, plague, and shifting politics. The Tigris, once heavy with the weight of slave-carrying ships, began to run quieter. Wars flared at the edges of the empire, between Persians, Mongols, Crusaders, and coin became precious in new ways. Invasions brought death and looting, but also disruption. Supply lines were severed, caravans from the Sudan stopped arriving. Nubian boys and Slavic girls no longer appeared in regular waves. Baghdad's markets, once insatiable, grew lean. But even as the grandeur faded, the institution did not die. It simply retreated into the shadows. Slavery adapted. The markets went underground, less ceremonial, more discreet. In the alleys of Al-Mansur, transactions became whispers instead of auctions. A new kind of broker emerged, quieter, crueler, immune to scrutiny. Buyers still came, but with thicker veils and heavier purses. By the 13th century, as the Mongol threat loomed on the horizon like a black cloud, Baghdad began to turn inward. Slaves were no longer just luxuries, they were necessities for survival. They nursed the wounded, buried the dead, carried firewood through ruined neighborhoods, and served generals who feared their own shadows. And then came the year 1258. It arrived not with warning, but with fury. Hulagu Khan's army descended upon Baghdad like a plague of steel and fire. The once glorious city, the jewel of the Islamic world, was turned into an open grave. The Caliph was executed, the libraries of Bait al-Hikmah burned for 7 days. Minarets crumbled, the Tigris ran black with ink and red with blood, and amidst this apocalypse the slave markets died, not with ceremony, not with justice, but with fire. Iron chains melted, record books turned to ash. The very buildings where thousands had been sold were reduced to dust. In the chaos, many slaves fled, vanishing into the smoke, never to be seen again. Some were caught and killed, others became refugees, and a few simply disappeared into legend. But for many, freedom came too late. For those raised from birth as property, liberty felt like a foreign land. Who were they without commands, without collars, without someone to obey? The cruelty of bondage is not just in the pain, it's in the hollow it leaves behind. Some tried to rebuild their lives. Former concubines married, became midwives, poets, even rebels. Eunuchs became advisors to local warlords, using the skills they'd once wielded in court. A few joined Sufi orders, where silence was considered sacred and wounds could be rebranded as enlightenment. But none were truly free, not from memory, because the ghosts of the markets lingered. In the architecture, a cracked tile here, where a slave once knelt, a faded inscription there, on a wall once used to bind captives upright for display. In language, the way a certain insult traced its roots back to slave terminology. In lullabies, songs that mothers hummed to their children, never knowing the words came from a stolen land. Centuries passed, empires rose and fell. Ottomans took Baghdad, then the British, then regimes born of independence and war. But the story of the slave markets, so central to the city's past, was buried. Not lost, buried, deliberately, because history has a habit of forgetting what makes us uncomfortable. The Abbasid Golden Age is remembered for its poetry, its architecture, its science. Rarely is it mentioned that beneath every dome was a slave girl scrubbing floors, that behind every philosopher's triumph stood a eunuch carrying scrolls, that the beauty of Baghdad was built not just with knowledge, but with blood. Today, tourists walk through Al-Mutanabi Street, buying books and sipping tea beneath murals of Rumi and Khayyam. Few know that, just beneath their feet, lie the bones of the silenced, their names erased, their stories edited out of textbooks, their existence reduced to footnotes, if that. But the city remembers. The earth always remembers. There is a graveyard in Baghdad, half forgotten, overgrown with weeds and choked with dust. It's not marked by names, but by numbers. Some say it was once used to bury slaves who died in transit. Others say it's where branded concubines were laid to rest. Those who died before sale, too damaged to profit from. No one knows for sure, but the air there is different, still watchful, as if waiting to be seen. And there are still words in the old dialect, phrases children use in games that trace back to slave commands. Kamas, they shout. Bow. It means nothing to them now, but it meant everything once. The horror was never just in the markets themselves, but in how easy it was to forget them. And that is the final cruelty of Baghdad's slave trade. Not the branding, not the rape, not the separation of mother and child, but the silence that followed, the way history swept its sins beneath silk and scripture, leaving behind a version of events clean enough for pride, but hollow of truth. But tonight, you've heard their voices again. The Greek boy forced to dance for men twice his size, the Ethiopian girl who braided her sister's hair before being sold to a merchant bound for Basra, the Circassian twins who held hands beneath the auction stage, the mute Armenian who carved birds into the market's stone wall, the Somali mother who sang to her baby even as buyers debated her price, the eunuch who wrote poems he could never sign, and the Persian girl who, in her final breath, prayed for a world that would one day speak her name. These were not numbers. These were lives, and they are not forgotten, not tonight. The markets may be dust, the traders long dead, the palaces crumbled, but the nightmare remains. Not in form, but in echo, in the lessons still unlearned, in the invisible chains that still shape how we speak, live, and bury the past. Let that echo stay with you, let it haunt you, because only then will silence finally lose its power. They called it Al-Andalus, a land where poetry floated through perfumed courtyards, where fountains murmured beneath moonlight, and calligraphy shimmered on every tiled wall. The minarets reached gently to the heavens, while within the great cities, Cordoba, Seville, Granada, art and science flourished. It was a world of enlightenment, or so the stories often tell us. But wander deeper beyond the tiled palaces and shadowed gardens, past the arched doors of the harem, beneath the silken lies of paradise. There, another reality uncoils, one not captured in the writings of courtly poets or the annals of pious chroniclers. It is the story of those who had no voice, girls taken from distant lands, boys sold into gilded prisons, the forgotten, the violated, the owned. We begin in Cordoba in the 10th century. It is midnight in the city of 1,000 lamps. The Caliphate of the Umayyads is at its golden peak. The palaces blaze with colored glass and light. In the harem quarters of Madinat al-Zahra, the night does not sleep. Slaves are being prepared, bathed, perfumed, painted like living ornaments. Some are no more than 12. Others are from faraway lands. Frankish blondes, dark-skinned Nubians, Circassians, Slavs, Berbers. They were taken in raids or bought in markets stretching from the Black Sea to the Sahel. One girl, her name long erased, shivers beneath the weight of gold. She cannot understand the language of her captors, but she knows what is coming. She was told it was a great honor to be selected for the Caliph's pleasure, an honor that begins with silence and ends with surrender. The men who manage the harem are eunuchs, themselves victims of a quiet, brutal system. Castrated in childhood and sold for exorbitant sums, they were imported from Egypt, Sudan, or Byzantium. They walk the marble halls like ghosts, enforcing order with soft voices and hard eyes. They hold the keys to doors no man may open but the Caliph himself. The harem is not merely a brothel of empire. It is a political labyrinth, a place where the womb becomes a weapon, where a slave girl's son might one day wear the crown. Every woman is a pawn in an invisible war. Alliances are whispered in bedchambers, betrayals hidden behind smiles. The exploitation is wrapped in silk, justifications wrapped in scripture. The slave girls are told they are being uplifted, educated, elevated by proximity to power. But beneath the incense and poetry lies something far darker, a system of human trafficking, normalized and perfected. Walk through the souks of Seville or Toledo, and you'll find slave markets nestled behind veils, Christian captives taken in raids across northern Iberia, Jewish girls sold by debt-ridden fathers. African children are transported across the desert in long camel caravans. Upon arrival, they are subjected to harsh scrutiny, examined for strength, health, and youth. Purity is commodified. Exotic origins are objectified. Some are trained as musicians, dancers, or scribes. Others are trained for the night. The buyers are not only caliphs. Judges, governors, and merchants all seek pleasure behind closed doors. The Quran is quoted, often twisted to justify ownership, and while many clerics decry abuse, others weave moral exceptions. It is said that a man may enjoy his slave girl as property, but must not impregnate her without permission. Such rules are broken in silence. There were voices who resisted, women who escaped, men who denounced the flesh trade in their writings. But they were few, and the system was vast. In Granada, a girl named Rahela is taken at 14. She was born in the Pyrenees, the daughter of a farmer, captured during a raid and marched south for weeks. In the court of the Nasrids, she is trained to serve wine with her eyes downcast, to memorize erotic poetry in Arabic she cannot yet speak. She is taught to walk as if gliding, to weep silently when needed. She is not asked what she wants. A courtesan in the emir's harem shows her the ropes, not out of kindness, but duty. "You belong to the walls now," she says. "Smile, or you will be replaced." And so, Rahela smiles. From Morocco to Damascus, Baghdad to Valencia, the same quiet terror echoes, the trafficking of beauty veiled in mysticism and luxury. The great civilization of Islamic Spain, for all its light, cast a long shadow. Many of the slaves were never documented. They had no surnames, no lineage, no tombstones. They existed as bodies, desired and discarded. Some bore children who rose to power. Others died nameless, their stories swallowed by the silence of history. Yet not all were broken. In Cordoba, a concubine named Sub rose from servitude to become the mother of a caliph. She manipulated court politics with chilling skill. For a time, she ruled from behind a curtain, but even she, the most powerful woman in Al-Andalus, began as property. The walls of Alhambra whisper their names. The mosaic tiles still reflect their faces, and though the chronicles are silent, the stones remember. History celebrates the beauty of Islamic Spain, the architecture, the tolerance, the art, but beneath the palatial halls, there was a different rhythm, one of muffled cries, one of lost childhoods, one of bodies used, repurposed, and erased. It is time to remember them, the forgotten, the sold, the silenced. The sun rises slowly over the towers of Seville. The minarets throw long shadows across the cobbled courtyards, and the scent of orange blossoms drifts from the gardens. The muezzin's call breaks the silence, echoing over tile roofs and down quiet alleyways. But behind carved latticework and heavy wooden doors, another kind of morning begins. Inside the harem, the day starts in silence. The girls are stirred from sleep not by sunlight, but by the voices of eunuchs. They dress without speaking, each fold of silk arranged, each braid wound tightly. Their reflections ripple in polished brass mirrors. Their lives are not their own. Some of these women came willingly, sold by desperate families, seeking protection or a better life. Others were taken by force, their paths stitched with grief. Most would never see their homes again. They are not permitted to write letters. They are not taught maps. They are taught only obedience. The harem as it existed in Al-Andalus was not a place of constant cruelty. It was worse. It was a place of beautiful captivity. The walls were painted with poetry. The courtyards were cooled by fountains. Music echoed through the arches. The girls were fed well, clothed in fine fabrics, their health maintained, but they were property. They learned to smile when watched, to laugh when touched, to make pain seem sweet. The emir's favorites lived in luxury. Their rooms were larger, their jewelry more elaborate. They had influence, if only fleeting. One wrong word could lead to exile within the very same walls. To fall out of favor was to become invisible. Older concubines, once beloved, now sat silently near the walls of the baths. They watched the new ones arrive, so full of terror and false hope. The cycle repeated with mechanical cruelty. The harem did not change, only its prisoners did. Outside, the markets pulsed with life. The trade in human bodies was not hidden. It was woven into the fabric of the state. Christian captives were particularly valuable. Blonde hair, pale skin, foreign tongues, these became signs of exoticism. Slave traders learned to manipulate fantasy. They trafficked not just bodies, but ideas. The West was painted as wild and untamed. To own a Frankish girl was to own the unknown. There were manuals, written in Arabic, that instructed how to choose a concubine, what body shapes pleased, what skin tone signaled good health, how to awaken desire, how to break resistance. These texts did not survive in abundance, but fragments remain. Cold, clinical, devastating. Boys were not spared either. In the courts of Al-Andalus, young male slaves served as cupbearers and attendants. Their beauty was celebrated in verse. Some were used as bed companions for older men of influence. The poets romanticized them with metaphors of wine and roses, but behind every metaphor was a child robbed of his freedom. In the libraries of Cordoba, scholars debated the morality of such practices. Some clerics condemned the sexual use of slaves. Others, influenced by older Greek and Roman traditions, rationalized it as an acceptable indulgence of elite life. The contradiction between religious purity and sensual decadence tore through the intellectual heart of the Caliphate. Back in the palace, another girl, Zainab, is summoned. She is 14, of Visigothic descent, with copper-colored hair and green eyes. She has been trained for months. Tonight she will be presented to the wazir, a man 5 times her age. She does not cry. She has already learned how to leave her body without moving. There is no escape. The harem is not a prison with bars, but a maze of rules and rituals. A girl may live her entire life there and never walk freely in the city beyond. She is taught to accept her fate as divine decree, that to serve a man of power is to be blessed. Some believe it, most do not. The power dynamic is precise. A woman's value is in her compliance, her youth, her fertility. If she bears a son, she may rise in status. If she does not, she fades into the marble. Some slave women learned to manipulate their conditions. They used their beauty as leverage. They formed alliances with influential eunuchs, exchanged secrets for favors, pitted rivals against one another. This too was a survival instinct. To be cunning was not sin, it was necessity. But not all stories ended in survival. In the outskirts of Valencia, a slave girl tried to escape. She had been brought from the Alps, taken during a raid. She fled one night, barefoot, hiding among fishermen. She was caught by guards within a day. Her punishment was quiet, never recorded, only whispered. Her body was never found. Her name was never written. Even in literature, their presence is ghostly. They appear in poems and chronicles only as objects of desire or symbols of luxury. They are not characters, they are ornaments. The silence is loud. The legal framework of the time allowed this. Under Islamic law, it was permissible to own concubines, to have intercourse with them, so long as they were acquired legally. Manumission, freeing a slave, was encouraged but rarely practiced in the courts of power. The wealth of the elite depended on the continual influx of human lives. Some caliphs had hundreds of concubines. They were kept in separate quarters, rarely seen by outsiders. Their children were raised to serve the court. The women themselves faded with time, replaced by new acquisitions. The harem consumed youth like a fire. Yet from these hidden women came moments of fierce resistance. A young woman named Layla, of Basque origin, was said to have composed forbidden poems. She wrote of longing, not for love, but for freedom. Her verses circulated in secret, copied by hand, recited in whispers. She was punished, silenced, erased from records, but her words survived barely in the margins of another scholar's notebook. "I am not your rose," she wrote. "I am the thorn." Today, we walk through the palaces of Andalusia, marveling at their beauty. Tourists photograph the arches, the calligraphy, the gardens. But few ask, who watered these gardens? Who suffered beneath this beauty? The history of Islamic Spain is rich, layered, and often romanticized. Its achievements in science, medicine, architecture, and philosophy are real and worthy of praise, but so too are its crimes worthy of memory. This forgotten sexual exploitation was not unique to Islamic Spain. It mirrored systems in Christian Europe, the Byzantine world, and the Abbasid East, but it must be seen clearly within its own context, because behind every polished floor in the palaces of Seville, behind every intricately carved wall in the Alhambra, there are echoes. They belong to girls who were never allowed to speak, and now, centuries later, we must listen. Night falls gently over Cordoba. The call to prayer fades into the dark, and the lamps of the palace flicker one by one. In the cool corridors of the harem, perfumed smoke curls into the air from copper censers. Everything smells of rosewater and ambergris, and yet, beneath the beauty lies a hush that is not peace. It is submission. A young girl, perhaps 15, kneels beside a bronze basin. She is washing the feet of a woman older than her, but not by much. This woman is the mother of the emir's latest child, and thus holds temporary authority among the concubines. The girl is new, still raw, still shivering when she hears footsteps in the night. She does not speak Arabic yet. She does not know who will summon her next, but she has learned that the less she says, the longer she survives. The older woman speaks to her softly, half in warning, half in ritual. Smile when they call you. Never eat more than they give. Never look directly into the eyes of a man with power. And if they ask where you are from, say nothing. You are from here now. This is how power rewrites origin. This is how geography vanishes inside the body. Outside the harem, in the wider world of Al-Andalus, people speak of culture and progress. They celebrate the sophistication of the courts, the music, the astronomy, the poetry. But they do not speak of the silent girls behind the mashrabiyah screens. They do not ask who tuned the instruments or who served the wine at forbidden feasts. In the grand libraries of Toledo and Granada, scholars debate Aristotle and copy medical treatises. Yet even in these halls of knowledge, women's bodies are categorized, not as people, but as properties. Texts describe the humors of the female body, how to arouse pleasure, how to suppress fertility. These writings are clinical, masked in language of science, but they serve one purpose: to control. Among the ruling elite, owning women is a symbol of wealth. The size of a man's harem reflects his status. It is spoken of in numbers, 30, 50, 100. The actual names of the women do not matter, only their types: Persian, Slav, Nubian, Andalusi. Their origins become labels, not stories. A particular type of slave gains popularity in the 10th century. The Jariya, a concubine trained not only in sexual arts, but also in poetry, music, and conversation. These women are bought at great cost, raised in elite schools where they are taught to recite verses, to play the awud, to speak eloquently. They become the courtesans of the Caliphate courts, decorative, brilliant, bound. Their intelligence is allowed only within narrow limits. They are praised for wit, but punished for defiance. A Jariya may earn influence if her talents impress a powerful man. She may even gain manumission and marry her owner. But the odds are small, and the price is always her body. One such woman, recorded only as Al-Karima, was famed for her voice. Her songs were said to bring men to tears. She was gifted from the Abbasid court to the ruler of Al-Andalus. She crossed continents not as a diplomat, but as a gift of flesh. Her life was reduced to a melody. Andalusi poets often wrote of these women, not by name, but by sensation, their laughter, their fragrance, their tears. But these poems were never for the women themselves. They were mirrors for male desire, tools for self-reflection. Their grief was filtered through metaphor, their longing stylized into stanzas. In one famous passage, a poet writes, "She spoke, and all the jasmine wilted from shame. She wept, and the Tigris flooded with longing." Beautiful lines. But the girl who inspired them, did she want to be heard, or just to leave? Eunuchs, meanwhile, continued to run the machinery of the harem. Most were taken as boys, castrated before puberty and raised to serve. Their lives are another layer of trauma woven into the palace structure. They are trusted because they are made harmless, desexualized, severed from their origins. Many of them carry the weight of two worlds, not fully male in the eyes of men, yet feared by women who see in them the eyes of the jailer. Some eunuchs develop complex loyalties. They protect certain women, punish others. Some rise to power, becoming advisors or spies. But none forget the blade. None forget the moment their body was changed by another's hand. One such eunuch, whose name is lost, kept a diary, brief, coded, scratched into the margins of legal books. In one line he wrote, "I have not touched another in 30 years, but I remember the screams. His presence in history is a whisper. Like so many others, he has been erased, folded into the elegance of palace memory. At times, foreign visitors glimpse these hidden worlds. Christian envoys, Jewish merchants, even North African scholars would speak in awe of the luxurious lives of the elite, but even they often remained blind to the cost. The harem to outsiders was an object of mystery, fantasy, sometimes envy, never sorrow. The laws of Islamic Spain, based on interpretations of Sharia, permitted sexual relations with female slaves. Consent was not a consideration. Ownership overruled it. This legal framework was rarely questioned, even by religious scholars. The morality of the act was judged not by the woman's will, but by the man's piety. And so, a paradox emerged. A society that built grand mosques, wrote love poetry, and developed advanced philosophy also sustained an economy of bondage. A society of light and shadow. Not every concubine lived in pain. Some grew accustomed to their lives. Some even rose to power as mothers of future rulers. A few became patrons of the arts, builders of libraries, defenders of peace. But even these rare women, like Sub, the mother of Caliph Hisham II, lived in a cage, no matter how golden. Sub, a Basque woman enslaved and later freed, rose to become one of the most influential women in 10th century Córdoba. Intelligent, politically savvy, she effectively ruled as regent while her son was still a child. Yet even in her rise, her story is shaped by the fact that she began as a concubine. Her power was born of exploitation. We remember her because she escaped the usual fate. But for every Sub, there were hundreds, thousands of girls whose names we do not know. Their lives folded into tapestries, lost in translation, buried in the quiet corners of history. Sometimes their memories survive in places we do not expect. In the margins of a 12th century cookbook found near Zaragoza, a recipe for rose-scented sherbet is interrupted by a note. A gift once made for Layla, who died too soon. No explanation, just a name and a taste. In a love song from Seville, the lyrics change slightly when sung by women. The words become a secret lament, passed down through voice, not ink. The song is not about love at all, but about the absence of it. In a bathhouse in Jaén, a carved stone bears the name Zara, etched faintly by someone's trembling hand. Was it the name of the enslaved girl who scrubbed the floors, or the one who once dreamed of the open fields beyond? These fragments are all we have, and perhaps they are enough to remind us that beauty is not always innocent, that perfume can mask sorrow, that silence too is a kind of language. As the night deepens over the palaces and the girls of the harem lie in rows beneath painted ceilings, they do not dream of love or silk or song. They dream of something far simpler, a door, an open field, a sky without lattice work, and a name, spoken freely without fear. The palaces are ruins now. Where once there were courtyards filled with orange blossoms, there are crumbled walls, weathered stone, and silent fountains choked with leaves. The voices that once drifted through the colonnades, soft songs, hushed prayers, whispered orders, are gone. But if you walk these ruins at dusk, when the sun lies low and golden across the arches, you may still feel it, the presence of absence, a hush that is too heavy to be mere silence. Al-Andalus fell, piece by piece, from the opulence of Cordoba's Caliphate to the fractured Taifa kingdoms, and finally to the last breath of Granada beneath the shadow of Catholic conquest in 1492. With the fall came exile, erasure, and a reshaping of memory. But what happened to the women? When Christian armies took Muslim cities, the harem was no longer sacred space. It was booty. Women who had lived their entire lives behind ornate screens were paraded as spoils. Some were forcibly baptized and married off. Others disappeared into new forms of servitude. A few fled with their masters to North Africa, where they entered new courts, new cages. The concubines of Islamic Spain left behind little. Their lives were not the stuff of official chronicles. They were not queens or warriors or saints. Their stories linger not in cathedrals or chronicles, but in quiet gaps, uncertain echoes, things almost lost. Yet across the centuries, glimpses remain. A letter written by a Jewish physician in exile speaks of a girl named Miriam, sold 3 times before the age of 17, who sang lullabies in Arabic even after she had forgotten her own name. A passing mention in a land deed from Valencia refers to a woman called Fatima, formerly of the palace, now working as a washerwoman by the river. A Christian monk's journal tells of an old woman in Toledo who knew the words to love songs no one else could translate. These fragments survive not by design, but by accident. Like wind-blown seeds, they land in strange places and take root where no one expects. Sometimes we find them in architecture. The miradors, open windows set high above courtyards, once allowed women to look out without being seen. Now, they gaze emptily at tourists. But those who built them had specific instructions. The screens must be carved so finely that a woman could watch a gathering of men and never be noticed. To see without being seen was both privilege and prison. Other times we find echoes in the art. The glazed ceramics of Nasrid, Granada, so precise, so beautiful, often include tiny depictions of courtly life. Dancers, musicians, veiled figures reclining with censers of perfume. Who were the models? The women who filled these scenes were not imagined. They were real. Their bodies immortalized, stylized, anonymized, and sometimes we find them in the words left behind by those who never meant to preserve them. A 13th century legal scholar, compiling case law from the courts of Seville, records the story of a man punished for striking his concubine during prayer. The scholar notes almost in surprise that she spoke Arabic well, quoted scripture, and offered her defense calmly. No name is given, but for a moment she is visible. More than a possession, more than a body. In the modern world, the legacy of these women is nearly invisible. Islamic Spain is remembered for its architecture, its philosophy, its coexistence of cultures. The Alhambra is praised as a wonder. The poetry of Al-Mutamid is taught in classrooms. But the concubines, the singers, the girls brought from distant lands to serve unseen, they are absent from the brochures. They linger only in the places no one thinks to look. In the rhythmic click of castanets said to be inspired by North African instruments once played in palace halls. In lullabies still sung in Andalusian villages, with Arabic cadences passed down through generations of women who no longer understand the words. In the silence of certain rooms, cool, domed, half-lit, where no one speaks too loudly, as if instinct warns not to disturb the dust. Andalusi history is often written as a story of splendor and sorrow, but it is incomplete without the voices of women who were never allowed to speak. Their exploitation was not a footnote, it was a foundation. The wealth, the beauty, the brilliance of the courts all rested on the backs of women who had no choice. To remember them is not to rewrite the past, it is to finish the sentence. Some modern scholars have begun to search more deeply. They ask, what would happen if we centered the concubine, the captive, the child? What would history look like if told through her eyes? One researcher uncovered a series of musical notations hidden in the margins of a prayer manual. They matched no known melody, but when reconstructed, they formed a lullaby, a minor scale descending gently. Perhaps it was nothing, perhaps it was everything. Another uncovered textile fragments in the ruins of Madinat al-Zahra, threads of silk and gold woven with care. It is believed they were part of a robe once worn by a favored concubine. The cloth bore no royal emblem, just a tiny stitched signature, Lamia. Her name, if it was hers, is the only trace she left behind. And in a dusty archive in Cairo, a letter, never sent, written by a freed woman to her former owner in Al-Andalus. It ends with a line as soft and devastating as breath. I remember the nights when I was the moon and you were the sea, but I was never free to set the tide. We will never know all their names, we cannot recover their full stories, but we can remember that they were there, that beneath the domes and chandeliers, the songs and science, the marbled fountains and the minarets, lived women whose suffering was hidden behind silk curtains, women who bore history not in books, but in their bodies. As the wind moves through the ruins of Cordoba and Granada, it whispers nothing and everything. It moves through arches once meant to contain joy, and instead carries longing. The girls are gone, the harems are dust, but the memory lingers, in the quiet places, in the perfumed dark, in the names no one wrote down, because they were never supposed to matter. And perhaps it is there, in that forgetting, that we find the true shape of history. Not what we remember, but what we were told to forget. Night fell in the Abbasid Caliphate like a thick velvet curtain, soft, rich, and heavy with secrets. The oil lamps flickered in the winding alleys of Baghdad, casting long shadows on the cracked walls of stone courtyards. Behind wooden doors wrapped in silence, another life stirred, one that was rarely spoken of, the life of the slave. And within that shadowed life, one experience was feared above most: pregnancy. To the free, pregnancy was a blessing, a source of legacy. To the enslaved, it was a gamble of survival, status, and sometimes, strangely, freedom. But the story does not unfold quickly. It begins quietly, with footsteps on marble floors, whispers between curtains, and the weight of expectation hanging over women who did not choose the bodies they served, nor the fates that awaited them. In the Caliphate, a pregnant slave was not merely a mother in waiting. She was a legal dilemma, a vessel of risk and reward, a pawn in the games of men and power. The moment she began to swell, just slightly, everything changed. Let us step into her world. Let us follow her, not with judgment, not with haste, but with quiet understanding, and see, behind the splendor of the palace and the glint of scholarly gold, a secret that society tucked away. It begins with the institution of al-Walad, a term soft on the tongue, but heavy with implication. Literally, it meant mother of the child, but in the Caliphate, it meant much more. A concubine who became pregnant by her master could no longer be sold. She was tied to his household. Her status changed. Though she remained a slave, she now had legal protection. If he died, she would be set free. So in the fragile ecosystem of the harem, where women lived and vanished at the will of their owner, pregnancy offered a peculiar kind of leverage, and that leverage was both feared and exploited. Inside the harem, the hierarchy was silent but strict. At the top were the hurrah, the free-born wives, below them the concubines, and beneath them the domestic slaves, the silent hands that cooked, bathed, dressed, and bowed. A concubine who became pregnant rose in rank. She was still a slave, but now she mattered, and to some, that made her dangerous. Among the women of the harem, alliances and rivalries were forged in whispers. When one among them began to suspect a pregnancy, the atmosphere shifted. It could mean a shift in power, a new heir, a favorite rising, a rival being born, literally. Some celebrated the pregnancy of a slave as a divine turn of fate. Others tried to conceal or sabotage it. Poisoned sweets, herbal teas meant to cool the womb, a misplaced shove down a staircase. There were stories, rumors, and behind each tale, a woman who carried more than just a child. She carried the weight of envy and expectation. Outside the palace, among the lower classes, the situation was different. Slaves were bought and sold like livestock. A pregnant slave? She was complicated. If the child's father was unknown, or worse, not the master, the pregnancy could be a death sentence. It meant disobedience. It meant shame. Sometimes it meant execution. And yet, there were those who risked it. Some women, in the briefest moments of tenderness with other slaves or guards or forbidden lovers, conceived without planning. Others, tragically, were impregnated by force, because for all the laws and teachings of Islam that protected women in theory, in practice, enforcement was another matter. Slaves did not speak for themselves. Their stories were told by others, by jurists, scholars, and chroniclers, and those stories rarely focused on the women's suffering. They focused on law. What to do with a pregnant slave? Could she be sold? Could the child inherit? Was the pregnancy proof of adultery or proof of property? The jurists debated in ink. The women lived it in blood. In the sprawling courts of Kufa, Basra, and Damascus, qadis, judges, deliberated over texts and testimonies. According to Islamic law, if a slave woman bore a child by her master, and the master acknowledged the child as his own, the child was free, and she, eventually, would be too. But that if was everything. If he acknowledged, if he admitted, if the timing aligned, if the court believed her. For those whose pregnancies were unacknowledged, life turned bitter. She could be punished for zina, unlawful sexual intercourse, unless she could prove the father was her owner, or that she was forced, or that she had been misled. How do you prove such things when you are property? So many bore their children in silence. They hid their swelling bellies under folds of cloth. They labored alone in corners of kitchens or gardens, sometimes aided by old midwives, slaves themselves, who whispered prayers over newborns wrapped in rags. And sometimes they didn't survive, because medical care was for the privileged, and childbirth, even in the best conditions, was perilous. But here, in the shadows of palaces and bathhouses, childbirth was often a solitary war. And yet, some emerge, not just alive, but transformed. The status of al-Walad was subtle but powerful. It meant no one could sell her. No one could separate her from her child. She was still a slave, but with protections. She was no longer a thing to be traded, and when her master died, she would be free. To some women, this made pregnancy the only path to liberation. There were even rumors, deliberate seductions, quiet schemes, plans to attract the master's favor in hopes of a child. It was dangerous, but for some it was worth the risk, because freedom, real, legal, and irreversible, lay just beyond the delivery. For those who succeeded, life changed. No longer ordered to serve in silence, they became figures of respect within the household, not equals, but not dispensable either. Some became advisors, guardians, women whose sons would one day rule over others. The child of a slave and a master, if acknowledged, could rise to great heights. In fact, several caliphs and high-ranking officials in the Abbasid court were born of concubines. So the slave mother became a mother of kings. And yet, she was never quite allowed to forget her origin. Freedom did not erase memory, nor did it erase the trauma of years spent as a possession. The women who survived the gauntlet of slavery, seduction, pregnancy, and childbirth lived in a liminal space, free but not noble, respected but not equal, remembered but not truly known. And the children they bore carried both privilege and stigma, because bloodlines mattered, and a child of a concubine, no matter how beloved, was always almost second to the child of a free woman. So the politics of blood continued, generation after generation, and behind the walls of history, the stories of pregnant slaves remained, mostly untold. But we tell them now, not to judge, not to rewrite, but to remember. Because the Abbasid Caliphate was not only a center of golden knowledge and architecture, it was a world of contradictions, where law and love, cruelty and compassion coexisted in the same breath. And in its silent corridors, countless women carried children under hearts that no one listened to. They deserved to be heard, even now, even here. The early morning haze in the Caliphate city smelled of ash, dates, and warm bread. But in the women's quarters of large households, from the grand homes of Baghdad to the lesser-known estates in Rai or Aleppo, pregnant slaves often woke in silence. Their lives moved differently now, slower, more watched, because pregnancy altered everything. It was not just their bodies that changed, but their legal identity, their social value, and the way others regarded them. For the master, a slave's pregnancy could inspire pride or panic. If the child was his, and he admitted it, he became a father, a legitimate parent in the eyes of the law, provided the acknowledgement was clear. But if the child was not his, or worse, if the woman's loyalty was in doubt, the pregnancy threatened not only his property, but his reputation. And in the Caliphate, reputation meant everything. So the question arose again and again, who owned the unborn child? Who claimed it? The answer could mean inheritance or death. Among the ruling elite, pregnant concubines were handled with care. If she carried the caliph's child, she was often guarded, monitored, protected. The palace midwives were summoned, her diet changed, her rest hours increased, her access to prayers and medical care widened. But this was not mercy, it was investment. The unborn was valuable, and so long as that value remained intact, so did the mother. But if the child did not survive, if it was stillborn or perished after birth, everything could vanish. Suddenly, she was just a slave again. Her status dissolved like perfume in the wind, and some suspected that when a concubine became too proud or powerful, misfortune found her. No one would say the word murder aloud, but midwives sometimes arrived too late, and the tea brewed for labor pains could be too strong. Behind the scenes, women in rival factions of the harem fought quiet wars. Pregnancy meant political leverage, and political leverage could not be shared. The jealousy of a childless wife, the suspicion of an aging concubine, the maneuvering of ambitious eunuchs, all these forces pressed on the pregnant slave like invisible hands. To survive, she had to be clever, humble, careful. Too much pride invited danger. Too much silence bred suspicion. Even her walk, her gaze, her speech had to be measured. In the lower classes, the situation was more brutal, more immediate. Slave markets did not welcome pregnant women unless they were sold as breeders. That term, breeder, echoes with cruelty, but it existed in certain rural estates, especially in North Africa and parts of the eastern provinces. Slaves were kept not just for labor, but for reproduction. Owners believed they could multiply their workforce naturally by allowing or forcing slaves to conceive among themselves. But there was no tenderness in this. Couples were often separated. Mothers saw their babies taken away. Children born of slave mothers could be enslaved too, unless the master was the father and acknowledged the child, which most often he did not. So women labored in fields with swollen bellies, praying for strength, for safety, for the slim chance their child might one day taste freedom. Sometimes they gave birth under trees, sometimes in storage sheds, sometimes with other slaves shielding them from the cold. And if the child cried, they wept too, because its survival was both blessing and curse. Infant mortality was high, even among nobles, but for slaves it was even higher. Malnutrition, infections, lack of rest, lack of care. A fever could steal a baby overnight, and with no burial rites, no grave markers, these tiny lives disappeared like dust in the wind. But their mothers remembered, even if they were forbidden to mourn openly, even if they had to rise the next morning in clean floors as if nothing had happened. Still, in the depths of the Caliphate's more enlightened courts, efforts were made, sometimes to preserve dignity. Some jurists argued that pregnant slaves should never be sold. Others insisted that laboring women must be allowed rest and recovery, but such rulings were only as strong as the men who enforced them, and in many towns no one bothered. So the world split. In cities of learning, a pregnant slave might receive legal protection, access to baths, dietary allowances. In the countryside, her belly earned her suspicion, or worse, resentment from other slaves who had no such fate. And still, the law of al-Walad hung over everything, a strange promise of delayed freedom. Once her master died, she would be free, but no one knew when that death would come. So she waited, years, sometimes decades, caring for her child, working within the household, aging in servitude, watching time eat at her body. Some died before the master. Their freedom, so close, remained unreachable. But for those who lived, freedom came into grief. The day of death brought mourning for some, release for others. She was finally not a slave, but what was she now? A widow without a marriage, a mother without legal lineage, a woman freed by loss. Her identity remained tethered to the dead man who had once owned her, and even in freedom, her past clung to her like old perfume, faint but never gone. Outside the urban centers, little changed. A slave woman's pregnancy might be met with anger or apathy. A master who refused to acknowledge his role could punish her for infidelity, even if he was the father. And proving innocence required witnesses. Who would testify for a slave? Who would dare? So many remained silent, and some disappeared. There were stories, hushed, mournful stories, of slave girls who vanished after their pregnancies became visible. No records, no graves, no inquiries, only whispers. She grew too bold. She defied him. She was found in the river. The Caliphate was built on law and order, but beneath that structure lay a darker architecture, of fear, of obedience, of hidden violence. And still, life persisted. Babies were born. Some survived, some became servants. Some, through rare luck, were freed, and in rare cases, they rose. They studied, they served in court, some even became scholars, because the blood of a concubine did not mean the mind of one. Children born of slaves sometimes surpassed their masters, and with each generation, memory blurred. But for the mothers, memory was a wound. They remembered the labor, the fear, the hope. They remembered wrapping their children in linen, tucking them behind stone walls, while they cleaned the hallways of the powerful. They remembered the sleepless nights when the child cried from hunger and they had no milk left. They remembered the prayers whispered over a sick child's brow, hoping God would intervene where men would not. And they remembered, most of all, the silence that followed, when the child stopped crying. History rarely records those moments, but they are real. They happened, and they live still, in the quiet corners of memory and the dark rooms of inheritance. So what happened to pregnant slaves in the Caliphate? They were used, protected, feared, forgotten. Some gained freedom. Some lost everything. Some bore kings. Some buried infants. All of them bore the weight of a world that both depended on them and ignored them. And yet, within that silence, they left behind something stronger than law. They left behind life. And life, even when born in bondage, has a way of surviving. Even now, even here. There was one sound that seemed to follow them. Pregnant slaves in every city, in every courtyard. Footsteps behind them. Sometimes it was a eunuch. Sometimes it was another concubine. Sometimes it was merely the echo of their own breath. But it was always there, because a pregnant slave was never truly alone. She was watched, not always with kindness, not always with cruelty, but with interest. There was power in her belly, and in the world of the Caliphate, power was currency, and currency could not be left unattended. In the palaces of Cordoba, in the great domed halls of Samarra, in the gardens of Cairo, slaves who bore children, especially those fathered by noblemen, entered an invisible stage. Every glance held weight. Would the child resemble the master? Would it be male? Would it be healthy? These questions swirled behind every smile, every bowl of soup handed to the pregnant woman, every herbal tea brewed in the evening. Even her dreams did not belong to her anymore, because she was not dreaming for herself. She dreamed for the child, and the child belonged to someone else. In some courts, the slave mothers were called al-Walad even before birth, a term of strange honor. It meant mother of the child, but it hinted at more, a transitional identity, no longer just a servant, not yet free. And though freedom would come only with the master's death, the social shift began earlier. She would no longer be sold. She would often be housed in separate quarters. Her chores lightened, her food enriched, but her isolation deepened. She had no real allies, no protection from court intrigue. And the moment the child was born, she faced a different fate: separation. In wealthier households, it was common to remove the infant from the mother shortly after birth. He or she would be raised by wet nurses, governesses, or elderly concubines no longer active. The mother was told, this is for the child's health, for their dignity, for their future. But inside, she often shattered. She had carried this life for months, breathed with it, prayed with it, sang to it at night when no one listened, and now it was gone, still living, but gone. She might see the child from afar in a hallway or during formal ceremonies, but touching was discouraged, emotional ties frowned upon, because she was still a slave, and the child might not be, or worse, might be a tool for others to manipulate. Jealous wives sometimes turned on the child's mother. She has bewitched the master. She used trickery to conceive. Or they'd whisper, that child is not his. These accusations could be fatal, and proving innocence was nearly impossible for a woman in bondage. So many stayed silent, endured the whispers, bore the stares, and in the shadows some plotted, not out of malice, but out of desperation. There are tales passed from servant to servant of concubines who wrote secret notes to jurists, begging for protection. Some scribbled prayers onto walls, hoping divine justice would succeed where earthly justice failed. Others took greater risks. They appealed directly to the master. My lord, I have served you loyally. I carried your child. I ask only for peace. And sometimes, only sometimes, that peace was granted. The master might give her more freedom, allow her to raise the child nearby, even permit her small comforts, embroidered cushions, a servant of her own. But These favors depended entirely on the man's mood, and moods change, so every breath was careful, every word rehearsed, one wrong phrase, and her privileges could vanish. Worse, the child could be taken again, because in the Caliphate, the child's rights were determined not only by blood, but by acknowledgement. If the master declared, "This is my son," or "This is my daughter," the law took notice. If he remained silent, the law turned its back. Some children lived their entire lives without knowing who their father truly was. They were told half-truths, that they were special, or that they were simply fortunate servants. But the mother knew, and she remembered. She remembered the night of conception, the months of nausea and craving, the strange aches in her legs, the fluttering inside her that felt like bubbles and wings. She remembered the pain of labor, the sweat, the screams she had to muffle because slaves were not allowed to disturb the master's peace. She remembered the face of the child, the nose that resembled him, the eyelashes, the tiny mouth, and she remembered the moment they took it away. That memory became her private scripture. She carried it for the rest of her life. Some tried to forget. They prayed harder, worked longer, immersed themselves in rituals or silence, but forgetting was impossible. The body remembers, and so does the soul. In the poorer quarters of the Caliphate, pregnancy was not accompanied by midwives or legal ambiguity. It was simple, raw, often dangerous. Slave women gave birth in crowded homes, with other women crouched beside them, holding their arms, whispering old sayings passed down from Persian mothers and Berber grandmothers. There were no physicians, only herbs, fire-warmed stones, salt water, and prayers. If the baby came breech or if labor stalled, there were no instruments to save them. So many died, both mother and child, and when they did, there was mourning, but only in the dark. There were no funeral rites for a slave, no grand procession. The other women washed the body in secret. Sometimes they buried her in the orchard, sometimes behind the stables, and the master never noticed. Life moved on. The laborers returned to the fields. The cooks prepared the evening meal. But something always lingered in the air, the quiet absence of a soul. Even in cities like Basra, where markets buzzed and scholars debated matters of law and astronomy, slaves were pregnant in silence. No legal scroll recorded their names, no poet wrote of their pain, but they existed, they endured. Sometimes in the night, a child cried out in a room far from its mother, and a woman lying alone in her straw mat whispered a name into the dark. It might have been the child's name, or it might have been her own, because in the world of the Caliphate, identity was fragile. You could be a concubine, then a mother, then nothing again, all in one lifetime, and all it took was silence. So she learned to guard her voice, to speak only when summoned, to fold her hands in her lap when others argued over her fate, to wait, because waiting was the only power left, waiting for freedom, for acknowledgement, for her child to recognize her someday and say, "You are my mother." Sometimes that moment never came, but sometimes, just sometimes, it did, and that fragile thread, stretched across years of silence, became something stronger than gold. It became love, and love, in the world of bondage, was the one thing no master could truly command. There was something different in her eyes now, not fear, not defiance, not even grief. It was something quieter, like embers that glow even after the fire has died. A kind of knowing, the kind only women who have carried life inside them and lost control of it ever truly understand. She had borne the child, she had survived childbirth, she had watched it be taken away, and she had not been broken. The world of the Caliphate, for all its learning and wealth, was not kind to such women, but it was fascinated by them, quietly, secretly. In libraries, scholars debated the status of al-Walad, the slave who bore her master's child. Could she be sold? No, said the jurists. Once she had given birth, she could not be sold again. Her womb had now become part of the master's household, like his gardens or his name. Was she free? Not yet. She would remain a slave until the master's death. Then, by law, she would be manumitted, granted freedom, but only if he had acknowledged her child. And so she waited, for years, sometimes decades, still serving in quiet corridors, still bowing her head when the wives walked past. still hiding her gaze during ceremonies where her child might appear. Older now, dressed in silk, perhaps even learning to ride horses or recite verses, unaware of the woman watching from the shadows. This was not a mother's life. It was something stranger, half sacred, half forbidden, like standing beside a closed door your entire life, listening to the sounds of a feast you were never invited to. Some women escaped, not by running, there was nowhere to run, but through cleverness. One learned to write secretly and compose letters to religious judges asking for formal recognition of her child. Another became a healer among the other women, her herbs and remedies making her valuable enough to be left alone. And some women, though very few, were granted formal status by their masters, raised above other concubines, even given titles like Hara, the free woman. But these were rare stories, tiny glimmers against a sky of silence. More often, she simply faded. Her child grew older, perhaps rose in the ranks, or was sent away, or died in a minor campaign, his name never recorded in the scrolls, and she remained behind in the servant quarters, weaving, cleaning, waiting, until one day the master died, and suddenly everything changed. The house would erupt into a storm. The wives would scramble to protect their own son's inheritance. The officials would arrive with scrolls, and she, the slave mother, would either be named or forgotten. If he had formally acknowledged her child and written it in his will, she would be granted freedom. If he had spoken of her kindly to his sons, she might even be permitted to stay in the household, now as a free servant. But if he had said nothing, she might be cast out, old now, with no money, no home. Some wandered to the edges of the city, to the courtyards of mosques or the huts near the river. They became washerwomen or beggars or disappeared altogether. And yet, even here, there was memory. There was always memory. In the ruins of an old slave woman's life, there remained a single ember of the past, the child she bore. If that child lived, if he remembered her, everything might change. There are rare stories of sons, now grown men, scholars or soldiers, finding their mothers years later, recognizing them, embracing them, bringing them back into the home, not as servants but as blood. And in that moment, the long years of silence and sorrow flickered into something almost divine. Because identity, in the world of slaves, was not fixed. It could be reshaped by a word, a name spoken aloud, a hand extended. You are my mother. 3 words, enough to rewrite a life. But not all sons returned, and many daughters were told nothing at all. Their mothers, pregnant slaves, became ghosts, not buried, just forgotten. Only the older women remembered them. The ones who had shared rooms, shared tears, shared silence. And so the memory passed quietly from woman to woman, in stories, in lullabies, in warnings. Never look the master in the eyes too long. Never let your belly show before the 7th month. Never cry too loudly. The walls have ears. In the narrow alleys of Fez, in the dust-choked corners of Baghdad, in the cool cellars of Damascus, the legacy of these women lived on. Not in monuments, not in books, but in whispered truths. A kind of underground scripture passed from one invisible woman to the next. A scripture of survival, of pain, of resilience. Some say that centuries later, long after the Caliphates had faded, there were still women in those cities who lit candles for mothers they never met. They placed tiny stones near doorways. They muttered names under their breath as they passed certain trees. They didn't know why, only that their mothers had done it, and their mothers before them, because remembrance, like motherhood, survives in silence. There was no statue built for the al-Walad, no poetry sang her name in the courts of the caliphs, but still she endures, in the blood of those who never knew her story, in the hands of women who feel a strange ache in their ribs when they hear a child cry, in the shadows of history where no light was meant to shine. She is still there, waiting, listening, and finally, free.